Good morning and welcome to another fabulous episode of Fresh Waves here on Whistle FM. We have a fabulous show lined up for you today, but before we start, got to give a shout out to Reese's Market and Bakery for giving us Morning Glory muffins this morning. Wonderful stuff they have over there at 5758 Main Street, so do drop by and check them out. Jason Rumble is our technical producer today. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning, Bren. How are you?
Great, thank you. Another fabulous fresh waves kind of day.
It sure is. Yeah.
Waves in the water, waves in the air, air waves, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
All in all, it's a fresh waves kind of day. I'm
definitely
really enjoying it. Welcome July. Happy Canada Day. If I haven't seen you already or you haven't seen my posts on Facebook, happy Canada Day. There isn't a better country in the world that you could choose to live in than Canada. And if you just happen to be born here, you're a very fortunate individual because this is a great country. Great country. So today on the show, we have Heather Taylor, who is going to be rowing an obscene amount of kilometers from California to Hawaii. I've always wanted to go to Hawaii, but I just don't want to go that badly. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And then in the second hour, we're going to be talking to Barry Martin from Yours Outdoors. Isn't that kind of a catchy phrase? Yours
I like
Outdoors.
that, yeah.
And they're from Halliburton, and they'll also be talking about paddling, just a little more low-key paddling. Anyway, to start off the show, we have Heather Taylor in the studio. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. So you are a former Stouffville resident.
Yes. Yeah.
And you have decided to row a very, very, very long distance. They say in nautical miles, it's 2,100 nautical miles, and in kilometers, that equates to 3,890 kilometers. I guess that's if you go in a straight line.
It is.
Sometimes you don't go in a straight line.
It won't be a straight line.
No. So you'll probably end up doing more than that, which is insane. That's crazy. So tell us about rowing. You are a rower.
Yes, so I grew up, well, I didn't grow up river rowing. My last year of high school, I started rowing at the Durham Rowing Club in Port Perry. And then I rowed for a year at Queen's University.
Now, are these the boats that you see in the Olympics when you're going rowing? So they're long and they're skinny and...
You just, either row one oar or two oars.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're made sort of for an individual. There are the big ones that are made for 20 people.
Yeah, well, you could row one person, two people, 4 or 8. That's the typical numbers that you would have in a rowboat. So those are what I learned in rowing. So then I rowed throughout university in the summers.
Okay, but not on a university team, because some of the universities do have rowing teams, don't they?
I rowed the first year on the Queen's university team, but not the rest of the years.
I guess it takes up a lot of time, doesn't
it? It does. I was falling asleep in classes quite consistently, so it just wasn't going to be an option.
No,
going
it doesn't
forward.
Sound like it's going to be an option. That's a lot of work. I know that extreme athletes who are really doing varsity sports of any kind, it takes so much time.
Yeah.
You really have to be willing to sacrifice one end or the other because you can't possibly do both, right?
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. You either do rowing or you don't do rowing in some respects if you're going to go for the elite level.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, now, how did you feel you wanted to go rowing in the first place? I mean, you didn't wake up one morning and just say, rowing sounds like a great thing to do.
I'm not actually sure. I can't remember why I did it. I was playing rugby, so but I had got a concussion the year before, and then my dad was like, no, you can't do it. The doctor had said one more concussion and you can't do sports anymore. So that was a bit of not a wake-up call, I suppose, but so that eliminated rugby that year. So I was without a sport, excuse me, to play that year. So I'm somehow thought about rowing. I can't remember why, but I looked up the Durham Rowing Club and went there on my own for the first time. And they had a learn to row program, so I learned how to row that spring and then in the summer, and then went to Queen's and ended up on the university team that year.
So tell us a little bit about learning to row, because it seems pretty obvious. I've rowed rowboats before in my life, and we always had a tinny at the cottage, and one person would swim across the lake and the other person would row, and you would hope that you didn't smack the person swimming in the head with the oar and things like that. And you could hear us siblings yelling back and forth to each other, "Get away from me! You're too close! You're too far away! What happens if someone..." Anyway, it was always quite a fiasco, but it doesn't take very long before you realize that if you're stronger on the right side, you're going to go left. And if you're stronger on the left side, you're going to go right, and that kind of thing. How do you learn to row in those boats that are a lot more sensitive, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, those boats are quite different than your average rowboat that you would see, in a movie of people rowing across a lake or a river or
on
something.
Golden Pond.
Yes, exactly. So rowing, you actually use more of your legs than your arms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's mostly a leg drive, and so your seat actually moves and it slides along as you go. So you basically use your legs, and then your arms are kind of like the last little bit, the finished part of it.
It slides back and forth
Yep.
or sideways?
Back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're moving that way, and that's how you're getting most of your power through your legs, and then the arms just hold it stable. So I would say rowing is an art of balancing on water, really. So that's how you can stay in the skinny boat, is the oars often are the balancing point of it. Yep.
Okay, because I have seen actually a friend of ours moved to Texas, and their son was on the University of Texas rowing team. But in the wintertime, when they weren't on the water, they had these machines that they were rowing, and they had massive competitions. It was crazy to watch.
Yeah.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah,
And again,
so
he had the same thing. He was playing rugby and football and had one concussion too many and stopped and did rowing.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a great sport, I think, for that.
And it's really fun to watch it at the Olympics. It's unfortunate that that's usually the only time you get to see it is every 4 years, because it is one of those sports that has those photo finishes and things like that, and you see the one that comes from almost in the back and, ooh, look at that guy. Oh, he's about to pass him. Wow, look at him go. You don't even care what country he's with at that point. It's just, you get to see this person go so fast. And it's really a cool thing.
Yeah, it's a great sport. You can see, I think, more with lots and lots of cable channels now. You can see it more often, world championships and stuff, but it is a bit of a hidden sport if you don't know it exists, and then it pops up at the Olympics every 4 years.
Okay, so you started rowing. You fell in love with it, obviously.
Yeah.
And you've kept rowing. So you went to Queen's University, and what did you study at school?
I studied geological engineering.
Oh, that's really interesting, and that's a very heavy course.
Yeah, it was lots of time.
And do you work in the industry now?
I somewhat do. So I work in the natural disaster area, so doing emergency management, so long-term planning and strategy for natural disasters. I do that in Western Australia, where I'm living now. So I live in Perth, which is where my dad's actually from.
Oh, neat.
Which is why the accent is there, even though I grew up in Stouffville. So, yeah, it's been an interesting road. I did the engineering side of it, and then in our last year, we did a group project looking at volcanic hazards, and that kind of got me down the natural hazards pathway.
So that's kind of interesting. You plan for natural?
You plan to make less damage. So
is that with structural buildings, or is it more with...
everything, I think. The best thing that you can do is land use planning is not building in a spot where it's going to get hit and damaged. So there's some things that are widespread, but then other ones, particularly geological ones, so earthquakes, if you don't build it on a fault or you're not building it on poor terrain or where a landslide's going to come down and hit you, your house isn't going to get wrecked.
Theoretically, all of California, you just don't do it.
Yes, well, if you're going to live there, you're going to have to build a better house. So building houses that are going to survive an earthquake, or putting them on different foundations, and don't build them on an old riverbed, build them on rocky ground. Yeah.
It's funny, there's some places in Switzerland where you can see that the landslide has come down, the mountain has deteriorated, and massive chunks, and then sometimes just all this gravel comes down and you see a house on it. You think, okay, well, if it happened once, what's to say it's not going to happen again? Even though they're offering a really cheap price.
That's why they're offering a cheap price.
Probably one of the reasons they shouldn't build there. Anyway, I'm making light of something that's probably pretty serious for the poor person who's living on the fault line. But anyway, so that you studied the geology. Has that helped you with your rowing, understanding how the ocean floors work, and or it's just a totally different thing? I
guess it's earth systems. So knowing how all the systems work together, because a lot of geology has to do with meteorology. So the weather, water is what is one of the few forces that can actually destroy rocks and shape them and change them. So understanding how the systems work and basic science principles of waves and airflow and pressures and temperatures and stuff. All that comes in from that background.
Okay.
So you can understand currents and why they would work, and think about, if that's going to do that, if you have a high pressure system, this is where your wind's going to be. So being able to understand it is a lot easier, having a science background.
Having that science background, for sure. And then having that understanding Because a lot of people have it, or some people have it naturally. You know, they kind of look at the wind and think, ooh, and they see the water and
Yeah.
I was out sailing in St. Lucia, and you could see that the wind on the water was coming a certain way, but it was coming off the mountains in a different way, and I'm thinking, this ain't a good thing.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it wasn't, because as soon as you hit that spot, it spins the front of the boat around if you're not really paying attention. But it's a science, but it's also an art, I think.
Yeah.
It's also a feel for the water. So when you're in Australia then, do you do a lot of rowing as well?
I rowed a couple years. Again, I ran into the same problem of falling asleep, but this time at work.
Oh, nice.
Yes, and I had employees at the point, so I couldn't really fall asleep anymore. So I did it for a couple years, and then I had to stop.
So what time do the rowers get on the water? I've heard horror stories of like 7 o'clock in the morning.
Interesting.
Or 6 o'clock.
I think I got introduced in the wrong way. So I started rowing in Port Perry does in the evenings. So I thought this was wonderful. You could go out and row in the summer and it was light. And then I got hit going to Queen's because they did morning rowing, which I've found that it's the one thing I can get up for. I couldn't get up for a run. I just don't see the point. But
Me either. I like to have my coffee and watch other people run, and I think, oh, doesn't that look nice?
Yeah. So in Perth, I was getting up at 5 a.m. Then you'd be done by 7, get home, then go to work. But again, about 10 or 11 a.m., you start to fall asleep at work.
Okay. So now you're living in Australia.
Yep.
And you think, boy, would it ever be fun to row a long distance? Aren't there places in Australia to row long distances too?
You could. So there are actually people who row from Western Australia to Mauritius across the Indian Ocean.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. It's a bit of a wilder sea.
I would say.
That's why I probably won't want to try that one. Because I know I don't think you're going directly against the currents. You have to go up farther north, sort of to the northern part of Australia, and then across, and you can follow. Otherwise, you get sucked down into the Southern Ocean where you would not want to be.
No.
Yes, but because it's such a big fetch of water that you get the wind build up as well as like massive swell over basically there's nothing between Perth and Africa.
Right.
So you get the swell building up. So it's not an ocean I would want to tackle first off.
No, but you could do some small things like going to Tasmania.
About the same distance almost.
What about New Zealand? How far away is New Zealand?
New Zealand from Perth it's about a 7-hour flight. So it's like going across the Atlantic. Australia's really big. It just doesn't show up on the map that way.
Yeah, no,
Global maps.
I know how big it is, but I'm just thinking, that seems like a little more manageable. But anyway, okay, so what made you think of deciding to start in California and paddle to Hawaii?
Well, it's actually a route that people have rowed before, so I wouldn't be the first person to do that particular route. I've heard about ocean rowing. I didn't even know it existed until a couple of years ago. I came across it in a film festival.
Okay.
In Perth, so I went to the Ocean Film Festival, which they have different films about oceans, and some of them you watch and you think, oh my goodness, what are you doing, you crazy person? Because this guy is, I think in Lake Superior, in the ice chunks are coming at him and he's trying to surf and he loves it. But you think, nutter, why would you ever do that? But there was one film about 4 women from the UK who had never rowed in their lives. Their mothers, sort of in their 40s, 50s, and they decided that they were going to row across the ocean. And so their journey of going across the ocean, 3 years later, they get in their boat and they go. And they had created quite a good relationship with the BBC, so their team in particular, because there's a race actually that goes across the Atlantic Ocean from Canary Islands to Antigua every year, sort of December to January, February. So that
I've heard about this with sailing, but I've never heard about it with rowing.
Yeah, well, I didn't know it existed. It's starting to become more popular. You might see it about January, February, like one news story pops up about these guys who've this last year they rowed across in 29 days. They had exceptional weather. 4 guys. Wow. Yeah. So before that, I think the record had been something in the 40s, maybe like 42, 43 days. So I heard of them, watched the documentary, and kind of walked out of the theater going, oh, that's maybe something I could do one day. And then I just filed it away, and then that was in March, and then June that year I came across an article about a lady who had done that, and they had said, just in the article, it's like, oh, she rode 3,000 miles across the ocean. And I was like, oh, that must be the same thing. So I looked up the race that they had mentioned and was like, ooh, maybe I could do it. So I put a message up on Facebook and asked if anyone wanted to do it, and there was a friend in Perth who had been keen. And so we started to plan, and we got pretty far. So probably about 3-4 months in, and we'd done a public Facebook announcement, and we're just about to start doing sponsorship fundraising. And then he had a change of heart and pulled out. And so that was quite sad. So that kind of killed the idea for a couple months, because I wasn't ready to do that on my own at that stage. And I never thought I would reach the stage I'm at now of doing it on my own. And then, the idea died away. And that was in November. And then I was still open to finding someone, but it's actually quite hard to find someone who has the time to do it, the mental stamina to do it, the physical stamina as well, and then gets the whole picture of it. So it's not about just getting in the boat and rowing. So you can't just be physically fit. You have to be have the seamanship skills. So basically you have to have all the skills of sailing, but not necessarily the sails and the rigging. But then also understanding that unless you have $100,000 in your bank, you got to work out sponsorship and build a whole campaign. And I could just pay money and go row across an ocean. But the reason why I think the idea stuck even after my friend had pulled out initially is that I saw it as such a great opportunity to do fundraising. And so that was something that I'd wanted to do with it. So that's why it kind of stayed. So finding someone who I guess is on board with the same cause and wants to do that as well. Yeah.
So what are you raising money for?
So I'm raising money for a maternal and child health project in Malawi. So that's through the work of Emmanuel International, who are based in Stouffville here. And poverty isn't something that is inevitable. It doesn't have to be there. It's something that can be solved. Not necessarily only by the people that are within it, because they're fairly stuck by having all there's barriers around them. If you've ever watched videos about the World Trade Organization, it's like, we don't want aid, we just want trade. So removing barriers of access to people and providing opportunities, that's probably where my heart sits. So this in some ways is a combination of the passions of, I guess, where my heart sits, but then also the sports side of it. What I enjoy doing.
Fabulous. So how have you been training for this? Because it sounds like it's going to be really intense.
At the moment, I'm mostly doing weight training and then just regular cardio. So I'm fairly active anyway, so I'll be doing something almost every day. In the week, it's just the scale of how long you go for in terms of the activity. And then the boat should be arriving in August, and then once that comes, then I'll start really picking up the time. But I've talked to a lot of people trying to figure out how do you train, so others who have done similar rows, and some people are ending up doing 5 hours a day, so 2 hours on the rowing machine, an hour spin class, and then 2 hours on the water. And I mentioned that to another person who's like, oh my goodness, I haven't a clue how on earth they fit that in. You just don't need to be doing that because the first week you're out there, you're going to be rowing more than you've ever rowed in a day. So I think it ends up being what you can do and what you can fit in, and then you don't want to burn out before you even get on the ocean as well,
right? And
it's something you almost have to be training into in terms of the cardio, but because it's not high intensity, it's just long duration. In some respects, your biggest enemy is injury, so that's where
that would stand to reason, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the weight training is quite important, is that you're trying to protect yourself against injury or muscle strain. So there was a gentleman who was attempting to row from Japan to North America, and 5 days out, this was just about a month ago, he had to pull out because he'd injured his shoulder. So, all that planning 5 days in, and he's had to make the call. Nothing was wrong with the boat. He wasn't, dying, but he had 5,000 miles ahead of him with an injured shoulder. So he had to make a difficult call and had to pull the pin.
That's disappointing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're training, you're getting ready to go, and you're a year out now, basically?
It's coming up on 10 months. That's less than a year.
Do you feel like you're ready to go?
Not yet. No. Yeah. No. So I still have, once the boat comes, I think I'll start to feel, I'll definitely have a freak out moment of being like, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn. But I'm actually getting my boat before a lot of people have gotten them.
So when you get the boat, are you going to be practicing in Australia?
I will.
Or are you going to be practicing in the US?
No, in Australia. Yeah. I'm still working, so I'll have to be working while training. And Australia's great because, or Perth, well, the whole of Australia is good, but Perth in particular has similar wind conditions that the California coast has. So one of the hardest parts about this particular route from California to Hawaii is the first 300 miles you're basically fighting to get off the coast. So it's the hardest bit you'll have because you have a onshore wind. I always get these wrong, but an onshore wind. So it's the wind coming at you trying to get off the coast, coming from the north west. But in Perth, it's similar wind conditions, except it's coming from the southwest. So trying to battle out against the wind as it's coming at you. Mm-hmm. And because as we discussed, the Indian Ocean's big, so you're ending up with very big swells and waves coming in on the West Australian coast. So it's a pretty wild coast. There's lots of shipwrecks along there for good reason.
So just to give listeners an idea, how big are the waves that you're going to be dealing with on a regular basis?
I don't know, actually. It seems I know that you can get up to 40-foot waves.
Wow.
And from the most part, you basically go up and you come down them. So it's when you get the wind that's going to tip them over and you're getting cresting and ideally not dumping on you. But at that point, you're in storm conditions, so you shouldn't be out on the deck. You'd be ideally in the cabin surviving it. But you will end up getting large waves. But how large? It's more weather conditions. Sometimes it could be just like a beautiful mill pond, glassy. Other days, just, ripples. And then you could have pretty windy and high swell days.
A lot of days it'll be those just regular rolling waves that you see on a nice sunny Caribbean beach sort of thing.
Yes, I hope so.
And you don't have to, they're not breaking when they're out.
No, so it's the breaking part that scares me, I think. But you won't know until you're in it how much they break on you.
So we're going to talk about what your boat looks like when we come back from our next little break. You're listening to Fresh Waves here at Whistle FM. I'm your host, Bren Masson. This morning we're talking with Heather Taylor, and Heather is going to row from California, from the coast of California to Monterey, if anyone really wants to know for sure. Monterey to Hilo, Hawaii. Oh my goodness. What an adventure. We'll be right back right after these few messages, so stay tuned.